Since high school, I've buried more people than I can count, just in addiction alone, but in the past 2 years, ever since the trank and fentanyl came around, it's tripled.
It's Huntington, West Virginia, a place so consumed by the opioid epidemic, it has been crowned the overdose capital of America.
The overdose capital of America, ground zero in a scandal that destroyed so many American communities.
The population here was preyed upon by any and everybody to distribute drugs how they saw fit.
Because this is where America's opioid epidemic began. It's where drug firms with so-called miracle painkillers targeted industrial workers. They seeded a scandal. Communities became hooked.
Some cases they would relapse and then they would blame you.
Yeah, I think people now understand how addiction works. And they also understand that the opiate problem was my problem. That when people would relapse, it would be because my peers put my patients back on opiates. Always, always, always. That's what happened to Jeff Conway. That's what happened to Mike from Alice in Chains. That's what happened to Mindy McCready. All of them put back on opiates by my peers.
The opioid crisis in North America began around the late 90s and continues to this day worse than ever. It started due to the overprescribing of opioid-based medicines by doctors for even the most minor of ailments and aches, of course spurred on by the pharmaceutical reps who wanted to bump their sales up, coupled with the proliferation of easy-to-get illegal alternatives such as heroin and, today, fentanyl. And to give just a brief glimpse at some numbers here, in Canada, and we're using them because they appear to have the most up-to-date information for 2024, there was a total of 47,162 apparent opioid toxicity deaths reported between January 2016 and March 2024. Of all accidental apparent opioid toxicity deaths so far in 2024, January to March, 81% involved fentanyl. Of all the accidental apparent opioid toxicity deaths so far in 2024, again January to March, 84% involved opioids that were non-pharmaceutical. Regarding this last point, this shows that even though only 16% of opioid-related deaths were caused by pharmaceutical drugs, this amounts to 7,546 people dying in the past 8 years as a direct result of doctors misprescribing incredibly potent pharmaceutical drugs. And the other 39,000 or so people merely use these prescribed drugs as a jumping off point to even more severe drugs such as fentanyl, which, just to offer some pharmacological perspective, is suggested to be 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine. This brings us to Pain Hustlers. Pain Hustlers is a 2023 crime comedy directed by David Yates of Harry Potter fame and written by Wells Tower, who it seems is primarily known for his non-fiction reporting in print media. It explores a fictional retelling of the rise and fall of a real pharmaceutical company, Insys Therapeutics, and its role in the opioid epidemic, based on the 2022 book of the same name. And just be aware, there will be spoilers in this review. We'd recommend watching it before coming back to finish off this video.
I'll be back.
Pain Hustlers follows Emily Blunt's Liza, a divorced stripper who's in dire need of money to access life-saving surgery for her epileptic daughter, Phoebe. She has a chance encounter with Chris Evans as Pete, a strip club customer who's drowning his sorrows because of the ongoing decline of the pharmaceutical company he helps run. After one whiskey too many, he offers Liza a sales job, who after being kicked out of her sister's house and forced into a sleazy Floridian motel, sees no choice but to accept. Pete forges Liza's resume as it comes nowhere near close to meeting the requirements set by the company's founder, Dr. Neil, played by Andy Garcia, who requires his sales reps to all have a PhD. After an initial rough start in the sales business and just before she's about to quit, Liza manages to reel in a big fish. A doctor who has such a market share of patients in the area that once Liza steals his affiliation from a rival pharmaceutical company, it completely changes the company's fortunes, rapidly allowing them to gain 86% of the regional market share. And just like that, the company is in a growth phase, expanding by recruiting a dozen or so sales reps, mostly other strippers, as well as Liza's mum Jackie, played by Catherine O'Hara, which allows them to muscle in even further on other pharmaceutical companies' territories. The sales reps are under instruction to push Lonarfen, a fictional pain medication based on the real liquid fentanyl-based analgesic Subsys, which was originally created for use in cancer patients, before Dr. Neil starts encouraging the team to push it to everyone and their dog for so-called breakthrough pain for things as mild as toothache, which the doctors are only happy to prescribe. Liza morally objects to this strategy, and this is when things begin to unravel. Dr. Neil becomes more impulsive and seems to be losing control of his cognitive faculties, leading him to make more and more reckless decisions. As her situation worsens in multiple regards, Liza reaches breaking point and turns state's witness. After securing the necessary evidence, the DA charges Liza, Pete, Dr. Neil, and the Big Fish Doctor with racketeering, fraud, and bribery, amongst other charges, sentencing them to a range of prison times typically lasting several years. Upon Liza's release, we see that she's set up her own skincare company with her mum and a gaggle of strippers. So, all's well that ends well, I suppose.
Next one's for the ladies. How many times have you gals been late for a high-powered business meeting only to realize you're not wearing makeup?
That's every woman's nightmare.
That's why I invented this revolutionary makeup gun. It's for the woman who only has 4/5 of a second to get ready. Close your eyes, Marge. And now you're ready for a night on the town.
Homer, you've got it set on whore.
Oops.
In terms of positives, Pain Hustlers is an interesting snapshot of the rise and fall of a relatively small fish in the big pharma pond, detailing the underhanded tactics of which we should all now be aware. It makes dark subject matter relatively fun without making fun of the subject matter itself, which is a difficult line to walk. The acting is great, with a brilliant cast. Emily Blunt, Chris Evans, Catherine O'Hara, and a pleasant surprise in the form of Andy Garcia, whom I haven't seen for years, was a cast with enough on-screen presence that it made most scenes a joy to watch. I think it might not be everyone's cup of tea. For example, some may not be happy with the fact that Pain Hustlers doesn't focus enough on the human element of the story, the devastating consequences visited on the people who unknowingly become addicted to these prescribed drugs, which is fair. But I view Pain Hustlers as more of a behind-the-scenes look at the tactics employed by pharmaceutical companies to be able to make the money they do, and the medical doctors who are complicit. As a topic, regardless of how important and culturally relevant the opioid crisis is, I get the sense from various reviews and comments left on said reviews that people are already bored of seeing it depicted in fiction or semi-fiction. With shows such as Dopesick, Painkiller, The Pharmacist, and others, I think the subject matter might just be too heavy and or hit too close to home to be sustainable for most audiences. Although for me, there could never be enough stories told of the absolute havoc wrought across swathes of Western civilization, not just because of the patent immorality of pharmaceutical companies, but also because of the governments who let them get away with it. Unfortunately, Pain Hustlers is light on this aspect of the story, with the government shown merely as a good guy who's just trying to do right by the public and stop the bad guy. The reality is, of course, far more murky. On a related note, Pain Hustlers is not as in-depth as better explorations of the subject matter, such as 2021's Dopesick, which is a truly excellent show which I honestly think everyone should watch. Although this is not necessarily the film's fault, I think topics such as this are simply better explored via the medium of TV rather than film. I actually think it does a good job with the time it has, it just doesn't have enough given the format. Similarly, Chris Evans' character is simply not given enough screen time. Evans makes the character compelling enough when he's on screen, arrogant and smarmy, but charismatic, but it almost feels like they only had him on set to shoot the scenes for a week or two before he had to go off to shoot a terrible sequel to The Awful Grey Man, or resell his soul to Marvel to save his career. It's a shame because he does actually offer a lot of presence on screen, so it's a shame he wasn't utilised to his full ability here. And finally, although Blunt is great as always, I think some of the scenes just pushed her too far past the niche. Specifically, several scenes required her to invoke the spirit of Leo in The Wolf of Wall Street, and, well, rather than me talking about it, let's just take a look at a direct comparison.
Until their client either buys or fucking dies!
Informs who you're gonna be tomorrow. You gotta work it like your fucking back's against the wall. You don't just work the territory, you own your territory. On a territory, you own a doctor. You own your territory, you own a doctor.
Like I said, a little bit past the niche. We're going to finish off these reviews with some quick ratings of each important aspect of the film, including plot, world building, dialogue, characters, acting, direction, and finally, genre-specific elements. Note that since it's basically impossible to compare films from radically different genres, say teen rom-coms versus gritty gangster films, the ratings that follow essentially reflect ratings made within the standards set by the genre, and so a complex sci-fi plot may score the same as a really fun rom-com plot, because each may have accomplished its own goals successfully, even if the sci-fi plot is infinitely more complex. Now, onto the ratings. First, the plot. Pain Hustlers is a relatively straightforward snapshot of the rise and fall of a mid-sized pharmaceutical company, their underhanded tactics, and their role in the opioid crisis. The plot is laid out in a solid enough structure, offering an interesting example of debauchery in the world of Big Pharma, although it does feel very much like a snapshot, which somewhat makes you feel like you're really only scratching the surface of a much bigger issue. What we see is mostly good, but I feel it's also missing that little something else. 7 out of 10. Second, world building. The world of Pain Hustlers is quite narrow in scope, mostly focusing on Liza and her family, and how their lives are changed for the better and then for the worse by the success of the company. We do get to see instances of other companies employing the same underhanded tactics, and we see snippets of the harrowing effects these drugs can have on communities. But all in all, it's a very narrow focus, which may have benefited from a slightly broader scope. 6 out of 10. Next, dialogue. The interactions between the characters, particularly between Liza and Pete, as well as the cutaways to professional-looking documentary-style black and white interviews with some of the core characters was, for the most part, really well done. There was not a lot of bloat, and the conversations we see typically impact the story in meaningful ways. The only issue is that I'd have liked to have seen even more interactions between Liza and Pete, as it felt like they left a lot of their relationship unexplored. 6.8 out of 10. Next, characters. The central characters we follow throughout the film are for sure interesting in their own right, but there's a major problem in that we simply don't get enough of them. Chris Evans' Pete in particular is the second most important character in the story, and we barely get to know him at all. His background, his drives, apart from the obvious of making money, his view on the morality, or lack thereof, of pushing potent drugs onto patients who don't need them, we barely get anything at all. This is unfortunate as, again, Pete has the appearance of an interesting character who's been given charismatic life by Evans, but that's all he really is, an appearance of a character. There's almost no real depth there at all. 5.5 out of 10. For acting, this was mostly really good, which is what we'd expect from an experienced cast such as this one. Chris Evans was the standout for the paltry time he had on screen, and Andy Garcia and Catherine O'Hara were their usual impactful selves. For Blunt, who I really like as an actor and who was great in almost all of her scenes, she unfortunately just plays some scenes too far out of her comfort zone when she acts as the leader of the pack, who's doling out impassioned and inspiring speeches to the troops. It just doesn't work, and it comes across as a little awkward. Other than that though, the acting is great. 8 out of 10. Next, direction. The overall direction here is good. The film looks nice enough and the story moves along at a decent clip, never lagging. Although arguably, the pacing might be a little too fast. We never really stop to take a breath and check in on how our characters are being impacted, how they might have changed with the changing world around them. For example, Liza transitions from living in a rundown motel to living in a swanky apartment overlooking the beach in what seems to be a really short time frame, although I'm not sure the film ever really tells us how long this transition takes. But we never really see how or even if this impacts her all that much. She reveals later in the film to Pete that all the money and success hasn't made her happy, likely because deep down she knows what she's doing is immoral. But for me, it just reads as, who cares? I think this arc could have been far more powerful and impactful if we'd have first seen her mood lift upon gaining access to all the material wealth she'd ever dreamed of, before later realising that money means nothing if she doesn't have any real meaning in her life. This is, of course, contradicted by the fact that her entire goal is supposed to be saving up for surgery for her daughter, but she's instead spending her salary on flashy cars and nice digs. But this criticism holds up either way, as the film really never takes the time to dig into the characters, as we've already covered. 6.5 out of 10. Finally, genre-specific elements. As an exploration of the opioid crisis, Pain Hustlers has an interesting take of narrowing the focus onto a startup company of sorts, a sort of small fish in a big pond story, which should give us the benefit of being more intimately acquainted with our main protagonists, but as we've already covered, this is unfortunately not true. And because of its narrow focus, it arguably fails to cover much of the important context of the wider disaster of the epidemic. In short, it's both too narrow and too superficial, especially when compared to much better analogues such as Dopesick. But in praise of Pain Hustlers, it is still an interesting enough drama. The story's focus, the acting, and the fact that it's based on a true story make it intriguing enough to make it worth watching. 6.8 out of 10. Overall, this leaves us with a somewhat satanic total score of 6.66 out of 10. Honestly, I think Pain Hustlers is probably one of the best films of 2023, although given 2023 is a barren wasteland of filmmaking, that's probably not saying much. I think this film probably isn't for everyone, but if the topic interests you specifically, then I'd definitely recommend giving it a go. If you like this video in any way, shape or form, please feel free to like, subscribe, comment, and all that good stuff. See you in the next video. Ta-ra.